Hello, everyone, and welcome to Threshold Education's interview series. So previously we heard from myself about my modern medieval languages interview at Cambridge. Today we're going to hear from my co-founder, Jacob Williams, about his experiences interviewing at the University of Oxford. So without further ado, Jacob, do you just want to give us a bit of your background and what we'll be going through today?
Sure, yep. So I studied PPE, Philosophy, Politics and Economics at Exeter College in Oxford. I applied back in 2011 and eventually, happily, I was successful and I studied beginning in 2012. So today we're just going to talk all about the interview, really.
Right, absolutely. And was there anything particular that you did coming up to the interview? How did you prepare beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, this was a interesting experience. I was very, very excited, very nervous. I remember one of my teachers at school had actually told me not to bother even applying. I only decided at the very last minute, I think literally on the day that applications closed.
Wow.
So I was pleasantly surprised to actually get the interview in the first place. This was, of course, after sitting the thinking skills assessment exam. So, so yeah, I was very much in a state of anticipation. And preparation wise, I think the main things that I did was I reread the books that I had mentioned in my personal statement. Now that turned out to be a complete waste of time. They didn't ask about any of them. I know some people, unfortunately, mention books in their personal statement that they haven't read. I definitely don't recommend that, just for ethical reasons, if nothing else. But that turned out to be a waste of time rereading those. I read the newspapers every day, following the news very closely in case they asked me about current affairs. They didn't. What else? I think the other things I might have done was maybe doing some puzzles. Possibly, I think I read a book about philosophical logic. That did turn out to be useful. Yeah, the book I read was called, it's one I mentioned in our TSA video. I think it was called, no, this is a different book. No, that's right. This was called Logic Made Easily. Logic Made Easy, yeah. And it was a kind of light introduction to logic, which was useful in the philosophy interview, as we'll see later. But yeah, the rest of my preparation was pretty much a waste of time.
Okay. Well, I suppose you didn't know at the time, but and did you do extensive research, for instance, on the course?
The course, yeah. I mean, I knew about PPE. I knew it was on the course. I knew that the first year was going to be an introduction to all three. Then you can choose to specialize in two of them. I knew the course pretty well. What, in retrospect, I maybe should have done but didn't was actually researching more about the interviewers. I could have
Right.
found out more about them and their academic interests. That's something that is useful, but not always, but is generally useful. You can go onto the college websites, find out who are the fellows in that subject. You're likely to be able to work out who's going to interview you. You may know someone who's applied to that college already. That will also help. And you can find out what they publish, what they've written. That will give you some idea what type of thing they may ask you about. On the other hand, it may not. It's not always possible to predict.
And just as an aside, did you know about the format of the interview and roughly any idea about who would interview you beforehand or?
Yeah, I knew the format of the interview. I knew that it was going to be two interviews. I don't think I found out until I actually arrived at the college exactly what would be in each of those interviews. So at Oxford, you don't have a general interview. No one's
Right.
going to ask you, why have you applied to study this subject? They go straight into asking you academic questions of the unpredictable, uncanny nature that we have already discussed. So I knew there were going to be two interviews. As it turned out, one of them was philosophy and politics, the other one was philosophy and economics. But I didn't really find out anything about the people interviewing me. I think I'd heard some rumors about some of them. I think they had said that the politics tutor was very harsh or at least challenging. It wasn't really my impression, and that maybe the philosophy interviewers were a bit more gentle. But these were just sort of stories that the other applicants were telling each other. So not
Okay.
serious research.
And how are you feeling leading up to the interview and up to the day itself?
Yeah, well, as I said, I was very excited and apprehensive. Um, I think I spent the last evening before the interview rereading another one of the books that I'd mentioned, which once again was a waste of time. And then on the day itself, we basically spent the whole day sitting in the JCR, that's the Junior Common Room, the
Okay.
kind of social space for undergraduates at an Oxford or Cambridge college, waiting for the interviews to be announced. They had a big board in a little side room outside this where they would write them down, but you wouldn't find out until maybe an hour or two before your interview. So we
Okay.
kept checking this. We were sitting there just sort of discussing anything really. Um, I think we were having fairly academic conversations and also just, of course, discussing each other's interviews and analyzing them a lot. And by that stage, yeah, we had talked about some of the questions that had been asked, and then the same questions tended to come up for all of us doing the same subject. And finally, when the interview itself actually came, I remember distinctly the first one. As I walked up the stairs towards the room, the
Yeah.
professor came out of the room to greet me, and he held out his hand to shake my hand, and I managed to somehow trip over the stairs, and I fell flat on my face, lying in front of him. So this is one of those things people often tell stories about how as long as you're memorable, that's good. You should do ridiculous things. I think there's a story about an applicant who maybe had a banana with them, and at one point the interviewer asked them why, and they said, so that you remember me. I mean, these stories are nonsense, but I almost like to think that this was memorable and that contributed to my getting in. In reality, probably
In reality, probably not. Okay, but just to clarify, this was not pre-prepared in any way.
not. It was certainly not, no.
Okay. And yeah, were there any particular other exercises that you did leading up to the interview? You've talked about Logic Made Easier, and you've mentioned
Yeah.
quite a few of them already.
Yeah, I read that book. I did a couple of exercises based on it. That was about it, really. Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't do any other specific training or anything, no.
Sure. What were the questions themselves once you got to the actual interview,
Yeah.
once you were in the
Yeah,
room?
so for philosophy, we were given a couple of exercises to prepare for only about 10 minutes, I think, before the interview. And fortunately, these were logic-based puzzles. So these were kind of verbal paradoxes or questions analyzing arguments. So one of them I remember was something along the lines of, if there is, it was more involved than this because you had sort of four statements written on the page. You had to explain which one might imply the other and which one might not. But it was something along the lines of, if everything has a cause, does that mean there is a cause of everything?
Interesting.
Any thoughts on what that could mean?
So if everything has a cause, does that mean that there is a cause of everything?
Yeah.
Um, is it perhaps asking about one central cause of everything, or
Yeah.
perhaps the logic between kind of reasoning cause versus outcome or effect, I suppose?
Yeah, yeah, that was how I identified it, that
Right.
it was asking if everything has its own cause, does that mean that there is one single cause of everything in the universe? So
Ah,
actually
right,
that's an argument from philosophy of religion.
right.
It's the cosmological argument, the argument that because all the things in the world have causes, there must be a single first cause, which is God, but not presented in that obvious form.
Right.
So yeah, so then we discussed these puzzles in the philosophy interview. And so this was the first interview, which was, I think, was also the one combined with economics. So the first half of the interview was based on the philosophy questions. The second half was economics. And in this one, I remember distinctly the question that I was asked, and actually that all of the PPE applicants were asked, was it went like this: why do they put Braille on drive-through cash machines?
Okay. Why do they put Braille on drive-through cash machines? Interesting. So this was part of the philosophy section
This was
of
economics.
economics. Um, it appears more like a
It
philosophical.
almost does. Yeah, it's very abstract. But
Yeah.
any
Uh,
ideas why they would do that? I mean, the obvious point is that blind people don't really drive cars. Yeah.
yeah, but they would still have to use them
Well, the thing
potentially.
about these cash points or ATMs is because I initially suggested this as well. The thing I was told is that no, you can only access this from the driver's seat of the car.
Ah, right. Okay. Um, so I'm not sure if there's a specific reason or legislation reason or
Yeah. I think some people suggested it was a kind of inclusivity idea that they had to make everything accessible to blind people. Another person suggested, which was actually the answer that I finally came to, which I think was the right answer, though there wasn't really a right answer. There were maybe even better answers you could have come up with. But what a lot
Yeah.
of us actually agreed on was that it was cheaper to only manufacture one type of cache point, to have
Ah, right.
one
Yeah.
production line, yeah, which is something called economies of scale. It's cheaper
Yeah.
to produce per unit on a larger scale.
Okay. Very
And
interesting.
that seemed to be a positive answer. I mean, I know several people who got in came up with that answer.
Okay. And did they give you any feedback about your answers
No,
as you were giving them? Not none
well,
whatsoever.
no, in the sense that they did criticize. They criticized answers. So if you had said,
Right.
well, maybe it's the law, they said, yeah, okay, but how would it actually? I can't remember what they said, but anyway, they criticized the less good answers, and that answer they seemed to be satisfied with. Perhaps that's because they were out of time by that stage.
Right. Okay. Was that criticism in a harsh way, or just furthering your thinking? I
No, not
suppose.
personal criticism, just responding to your idea. That's what they do
Yeah.
at both universities. I think Oxford is even more so like this.
Yeah.
There's
Perhaps.
no real, there's no obvious right or wrong answer. What they're interested in is how you think. So they respond to your answers with suggestions, with ways in which your answer might be flawed, and that's just designed so that you can think more and show them that you can think. The point of that, of course, is because the tutorial system or the supervision system, as they call it at Cambridge, is based on this kind of dialogue with your professor, with your teacher. So they're really just finding out if you respond well to that kind of stimulus.
Yeah. Absolutely. And do you remember your answer to the kind of cause and effect, the theological argument
Well,
question?
as far all I can remember is what I said before, that it was something to do with um, everything having a cause, not implying there is a single cause, which is
Right.
actually, I think, a point from David Hume, 18th century philosopher, who said something pretty similar in a book when he criticized the cosmological argument. So I might have mentioned that as well. They're not really interested in that, though. They're interested in your own thought process, not
Right.
whether you
Yeah.
know what X philosopher said about X issue.
Okay. Very interesting. And how did you feel about these questions as you were being asked them? Yeah. What were your specific
Yeah,
thoughts? Or
I think generally I was just sort of very, very excited and just eager to sort of do the best I could to come up with something interesting. I mean, I was aware that you have to like show your workings. You don't
yeah.
just sit there in silence and then think
Yeah.
of what you think is the right answer. Though, having said that, it's absolutely fine to take a pause, to think if you need to. That's fine. Um, yeah, and I was aware there wasn't necessarily any specific answer they were looking for, so I kind of tried to enjoy it, I guess. I remember then the second interview, philosophy and politics. Now this one was interesting because the politics tutor asked me a question which I basically turned into a philosophical question. So this question was, when, if ever, is it right to break the law?
Right. Okay.
What would your answer to that be?
When, if ever, is it right to break the law? I suppose many people, and I would perhaps also argue that it's better if the good outweighs the bad. If you
Yeah,
think the good consequences which would outweigh those negative ones, you have to
yeah.
make your own judgment, perhaps.
Yes, I think the response would have been, well, that undermines the entire concept of law. If every citizen
Yeah.
judges for themselves when a law is worth obeying and when it's worth breaking, you may as well not have a law. Um, But that wasn't what I said. What I actually did was something which I don't think they were expecting, was that I argued that we have no knowledge of any moral claim at all.
Okay. Wow.
So I argued that we can't answer the question, that it's inherently unknowable. We can't know anything about right and wrong. And my reasoning for this was that all knowledge must either come from sensory experience
Right.
or it must be based on pure logic. And pure logic can't tell you about this because it can only tell you what is possible or necessary and what makes sense, doesn't tell you what actually exists in the world. Sensory experience can't tell you because we don't learn about right and wrong through our senses.
No.
Right is not a property you see, hear, smell, touch, whatever. So I said on that basis, we can't know right and wrong. We can't know about the right and wrong of breaking the law. And at that point, the philosophy professor, who had not been planning to really engage with that question, took over. And we had a lengthy discussion. The entire rest of the interview, I think about 15 minutes, was him challenging this, and I tried to defend my point of view.
Okay. How do you think that went down?
Yeah, well, I think it was okay. I mean, he came up with a lot of problems. He talked about. I'm trying to remember the exact arguments, which I can't now. But one of them was something to do with color, I think, and how maybe we can't sense color either because other people could experience color in a different way in their own
Yeah.
subjectivity, and we don't know that. Something
Yeah.
like that. And I think I argued that's not a good analogy. Um, yeah, so we had this kind of discussion, and I think well, all these kind of issues came up about maybe not trusting your senses in general. I think that may have been one of the issues. Yeah, and by the end of it, though, I think what I had suggested was still standing in the sense that now, obviously, I'm not going to prove anything
Yeah.
interesting. I'm not going to come up with anything interesting, but at least in that sort of 10 minutes we've been talking about it, I hadn't had to retract it. But equally, I had taken on board what he had said. And I honestly think that that is why I got the offer, because I managed to engage in this effective discussion with him and defend a point of view rigorously. So yeah, that's I mean the reason that that worked was because I'd spent a lot of time thinking about that exact question, about the question of knowledge and the types of knowledge that we may or may not have. So I was well prepared to discuss that actually,
Yeah.
and I managed to turn a question that wasn't really about that issue into one that I knew a lot about. This is quite a high risk strategy. It
Right.
wasn't a strategy. It was just good luck that I was able to do that in a way that worked, and they were happy to talk about it in the way I wanted to. So so often they can be very unpredictable. Really, is the lesson that I would take from that.
Yeah. And so, in hindsight, are there any particular strategies that worked or that you would recommend repeating or that didn't work so well?
Well, I've mentioned already things like books. Not much point reading them. I think Cambridge is different. I think they do sometimes ask you about books in your personal statement. I've heard this.
Yeah.
So, but Oxford very rarely do. Now, my interviews were quite unusual in that most of the time, though not all, but most of the time, economics interviews will be actually based on a problem sheet. It will be a kind of maths-based problem sheet. Things they like to ask about there include things like game theory. That comes up a lot, like the prisoner's dilemma and variations on that. Worth preparing that. And again, they're a little bit harder than the type of question you would get in the entrance exam, like the thinking skills assessment. But they're not fundamentally testing your mathematics. They're testing whether you can apply it to a new situation.
Okay.
So these kind of puzzles come up a lot. Philosophy, formal logic, I was right there. That's very likely to come up. Knowing a little bit about it is really useful. There's also a book called The Logic Manual by Volker Halbach, which is the actual first year, Oxford's first year logic textbook. Reading a chapter or two of that may be very helpful. And for politics, they sometimes give you a bit of reading to do, a
Okay.
text either analyzing political theory or political practice. So just reading lots of good quality material about politics is helpful as well. But apart from that, I would just say the most important thing is to understand what they're looking for, which is that you can engage well with serious, challenging academic discussion and essentially benefit well from that method of teaching. So don't be afraid to take a pause and think, show your
Yeah.
workings, and be willing to change your answer. That's very important, that you can change your answer and show that you're listening to what they say. So those are, I guess, would be my main piece of advice.
Okay. Yeah. Any further lessons or guidance that you'd recommend? Or
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, a lot of it applies to all interviews. Those general things about how to deal with them.
cool.
Um, yeah, so obviously Cambridge is slightly different. I'm sure you would know better than me, but they have a general interview as well, where that's I think that's where you just kind of talk about your reasons for applying. Is that right? And
Um,
your CV, your personal statements.
it was a mixture of personal statement based questions, a lot of personal statement based questions, and perhaps one or two on why I'd applied there. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the personal statement's more important for Cambridge in that sense. Yeah. Very very rarely comes up in Oxford. I mean, I've talked to people and looked at, I think, dozens, if not hundreds, of past interview experiences, and
Yeah.
only one or two ever asked about the personal statement at Oxford. Yeah. So yeah, that is pretty much it. So thank you all for watching. I hope you found that enlightening. We will be continuing with the interview series next week. We will be picking an expert on another subject, and we will let you know about that soon. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to this video by pressing the button just here, and you'll be the first to know about any new information we come out with. And if you want any more advice, any more personal help with anything related to Oxbridge, please don't hesitate to call or email or visit our website using the details in the description. Thank you all for watching once again.
Thanks very much.
Without an education, don't be a dropout. Stay in school now, listen to me. Kids,